Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Teresa Palmer notices that there's something wrong with the twin in this Shudder original. After one of her twins, Nathan, played by Tristan Ruggerai, dies in a car crash, Rachel, played by Teresa Palmer, joins her writer husband Anthony, played by Stephen Cree, in returning to his native Finland with their surviving twin Elliot, also played by Ruggerai. But shortly after they move in, Rachel begins to notice that Elliot is acting strangely, sometimes insisting that he is Nathan, and starts to suspect something sinister, even supernatural, may have taken their child. The Twin is the English language debut of Finnish director Taneli Mustonen, who also co-wrote the screenplay, who's probably best known for the slasher film Lake Bodom that was picked up by Shudder in many territories. This film is also a Shudder original, but it's also getting a limited US theatrical run alongside the Shudder release, and in several other territories, it's just a straight-up theatrical release. It's an independent film that was picked up by Shudder, as with many of their acquisitions. The film is also notable for the fact that it actually reunites the stars of A Discovery of Witches, Stephen Cree and Teresa Palmer, who are both leads in that series, and I haven't seen a single episode of it, so I can't say whether that's a good show or not, but hey, if you're a fan of it, good for you! What I will say, though, is if you're a horror fan and you're wondering where a lot of the original movies have gone, they've mostly been picked up by Shudder in the last few years, who have definitely been trying to support a lot of independent genre films. Even the bad ones, like such is the case here, because unfortunately The Twin is a doppelganger of several much better horror films. Okay, let me try and find something positive before I really go all in on the bashing. If there is one positive about The Twin that I can point to, it's Teresa Palmer. Palmer is a very underrated performer, and clearly she saw something in this material, and if you look closely, you can kind of see why it is, because The Twin is yet another horror movie about maternal grief, and we've had a lot of stories like this over the last few years to the point where it might become oversaturated and too familiar at this point. Certainly, a lot of these movies are taking inspiration from The Babadook, although rarely do they ever get up to that sort of level. But you can kind of see, if you were choosing a character to play, how this might work as drama alongside horror, in the fact that Rachel is someone that has lost her child and is grieving over that, but also has to deal with the anxiety of potentially losing another one, especially because he is a twin, so he is a constant reminder of what she has lost, a constant reminder that something has happened to her, that even though she has transplanted herself to Finland, she can't entirely get away from. Their entire daily life is peppered with things that remind her of her lost Nathan, not just the fact that the bedroom of Elliot has a spare bed where Nathan would have slept. So that in of itself also reinforces the idea of mirroring, in that her anxieties are mirrored through Elliot, and by extension Nathan, as the two start to become intertwined and start to mix up in her mind, and Palmer commits to this 100%. Palmer's performance is so solid that it actually kept me invested in this for longer than perhaps I should have been in hindsight, but I thought to myself, well, Palmer is acting her socks off, so it might go somewhere interesting, there might be a payoff to this. There isn't, but at least she tried. And I will say, the film makes fantastic use out of its location work. The movie did actually shoot in Finland with local crew and everything, and the film does have a really beautiful but also kind of sinister vibe, especially because the film makes extensive use out of forests and tree lines that give this kind of remote, isolated sense to the photography. And I think you can really tell that I'm scraping for compliments when I start giving kudos to the location work. Unfortunately, that's where most of the positives end. The film is dominated by dream sequences, always a major warning sign in a horror movie. Rachel keeps having these dreams about Elliot night after night. Sometimes she'll be chasing after him and then he suddenly disappears. He's very good at doing that in real life as well, but then others, he's either doppelgangered, or other times he just stares at her creepily, not helped by the fact that sometimes she wakes up from these dreams to see him watching over her in bed. And in reality, Elliot is also acting very peculiarly, at times insisting that he's actually Nathan and acting like him, to the extent that he keeps sleeping in the wrong bed, to his mother's frustration. And clearly they only had 2 beds, largely to set up this particular gag. But even so, Rachel's maternal intuition is acting up. Clearly, there is something sinister afoot here. Something has plans or designs on her child, and it may well be even supernatural, or it may be the house, or something to do with this place. And certainly the film does that common horror movie trick of making it so that reality and dreams blend together to the extent that you cannot tell which is which at times, and the movie deliberately obfuscates how much is actually happening. Of course, you might also be familiar with that because it's a common trick of bad horror movies as well, especially the opening section of the movie, which right away let me know that something seriously bad was afoot right away, because it was those split-second scenes where you're not actually allowed to see what's happening that usually indicate that there is a bad twist coming up that, if told in a straightforward fashion, would be immediately obvious to the audience, and so they have to rely on clumsy editing tricks to try and hide things that otherwise we'd be able to work out well in advance. Although, frankly, in hindsight, I don't think that really worked for them. But there is a lot of very weird cutting in this movie. There are strange jumps in time. The film feels disjointed and erratic, sometimes confusingly so, even in the first act, where it's ostensibly meant to be setting things up. And then, on top of that, you got this pervasive sense of familiarity about the entire thing, right from the concept up, because twins is one of the most ludicrously overused ideas in horror. It's something that we've seen countless times before. These whole ideas of mirroring and doppelgangering, we've seen them in so many things that honestly, they don't have any charge anymore. The twin offers nothing new to the table on that count, and in fact, you've not just probably seen this film before, you've probably seen several different versions of this film before, because The Twin is one of those horror movies that feels like it's made up of recycled pieces of about 10 different better horror films, just smushed together into an incoherent mess. Watching The Twin for me was a very strange experience, because it felt like I was watching some kind of weird horror wheel of fortune, waiting for it to land on what particular overused horror film it was actually going to become. So at first, I thought maybe it's a haunted house movie, because there is an early sequence where Rachel finds a cupboard in what will become Elliot's bedroom. Maybe there's something sinister about the property. No, that's not really it. So maybe it's going to become The Shining, because you got the twins thing, obviously, and the writer-husband, and the writer-husband does seem a bit off in some way. Maybe there is something sinister about him, not helped by the fact that there's a brief moment where he appears to be drinking. Maybe he's an alcoholic like Jack Torrance was. But maybe it isn't that. Maybe it's trying to be Don't Look Now, especially because Elliot so often wears a red coat, and we are literally just taking that particular element from that movie and placing it in our own. But maybe it wants to be something else. Maybe it wants to be Midsummer, obviously, because Scandi horror is a thing. So all the villagers in town are all very shifty and suspicious. Maybe there's something up about them. Maybe they're all working together. Everyone's in on it. Maybe the town itself has some kind of evil at the centre of it. Especially that doctor fellow. That doctor doesn't seem to talk very much, but the way he looks through his glasses, he looks like a wrong and right there. So maybe it's the town. And obviously we can play up all these ideas of evil foreigners that have all been dug up again because of movies like Midsummer. And then the movie transitions into the next one it wants to gladly pilfer from, Rosemary's Baby. And that's the groove it seems to largely settle on. This whole idea that actually the town maybe plans for Elliot to have some sort of demonic possession, that they perhaps want to use him as a vessel for reincarnating the devil itself, that the entire town is built as a conduit for evil. Circles are meant to be a major visual motif all throughout. And it's kind of impressive that a movie 50 years old now is still getting exact carbon copies like this, but the twin follows through the Rosemary's Baby knockoff list pretty much entirely. Whole scenes actually are probably verbatim in this movie almost. The character of Helen is a walking embodiment of the twins' problems on a story level. Helen is the other outsider in town who immediately connects with Rachel because of that, and she is that crucial secondary exposition character who delivers all the dark secrets of the town and all the information that the main character needs. And Helen has a pretty wild backstory of her own. There is a flashback where she relays what happened to her late husband, who turns out to have been used as the vessel for a demonic possession. It's very rare to say that the movie has a demonic possession in it that turns out to be entirely incidental to the film's plot, but boy, The Twin is that rare movie. So the character of Helen is one of those that is meant to inspire intrigue in the audience as we try and work out what her role is and what her connection is to the plot of the movie. And there are several moments where Helen actually seems to be weirdly connected with Rachel beyond the obvious, to the point where when Helen falls asleep, she appears to be psychically connected to Rachel and what's happening in her dreams. And that turns out to not actually be anything. I don't know what that actually turns out to be connected to, if anything, because it's a plot strand that kind of goes nowhere. And there's a lot of things about this character that genuinely go nowhere. The character ends up being so confusing that I would almost argue that she's a plot hole as a character, pretty much, because by the end of the movie, I actually had more questions about this character than I actually had answers, because the way that character exits out of the movie is especially confusing, because her fate, it looks like it might have happened, but it probably didn't. And also, why would it happen that way if something else didn't? It's so ridiculous. The movie clearly gets itself wrapped up in knots regarding this character and pretty much this entire lore. It makes for a very frustrating viewing experience because this is supposed to be a mystery. We're supposed to be solving what's going on here alongside Rachel, but the movie is either deliberately withholding crucial clues until the very end of the movie, or offering us clues that seem to be prominent and important and then turn out to not be so. And yes, sometimes you do get red herrings in a movie like this, but it feels like The Twin is made up of so many red herrings, you could pretty much make another red jacket out of them for Elliot to wear. It is ridiculous how much the movie seems to set up or imply about the events, and then has no interest on following through on or clarifying or explaining why it happened in the first place. It literally goes, here's a creepy thing, and then just doesn't elaborate on it any further. Just absolutely nonsensical. After a certain point, the plot begins to become completely indecipherable because so much stuff seems to happen and then is immediately contradicted. It is incredibly annoying, to the point where I thought the movie was actually wrapping things up, and then it turned out there was still another half hour to go somehow. and then I discovered why there was that much time left over. But if you think that's bad, wait until you get to the ending. The conclusion of this movie, without giving away the big twist, revolves around a major revelation that pretty much turns the entire plot on its head, which is a very kind way of saying that entire swaths of the movie are made pointless by it, and things that seem to be key plot points actually turn out to be stunning wastes of time. And it's an aggravating finish made even more so by the fact that I actually guessed it 5 minutes in. I was red flagged by that intro, and I thought, how could this movie end? And immediately came upon that option and discounted it because I thought, no, it couldn't be that straightforward and obvious. It can't be that simple. No, it turns out it was exactly that, and most of the remaining 90 minutes or so was the film pretty much jangling keys in my face to distract me from the absolutely obvious. Again, it's a bad twist that the audience would have immediately known about had we actually been given the information to decode it for ourselves properly, and astute horror fans will probably guess it fairly early, especially because it's another thing pilfered from a much better known horror film, one that also revolves around siblings, which should probably give you a fairly heavy hint as to what it is. It's the kind of twist that has been copied in numerous other movies, and it doesn't work in them either. I remember it used to be a very common twist in horror films, to the point where actually seeing it in a movie after this long feels like I'm reuniting with an old friend, because I genuinely haven't seen a movie have the audacity to use such an audience-insulting conclusion like this in a very long time. As you've probably already deduced, I can't recommend The Twin unless you're a die-hard horror fan that needs something to watch while you do the ironing, or a hardcore Discovery of Witches fan that'll watch any movie the cast appears in. Aside from those two very small niches, steer far away from this movie. Teresa Palmer cannot save this incredibly incoherent hodgepodge of tired old horror movie tropes that you've probably seen done better about a billion times before. It feels like the kind of derivative, uninspired and forgettable film that would have been clogging up multiplexes 10 to 15 years ago. It feels like a movie that would have got a big theatrical release in 2008, and it feels like the last vestige of this kind of genre fare is on streamers, and it feels like the natural home for this sort of thing, the kind of movie that would be shut off by people on streaming about half hour in while they look for something far more inspired. In fact, this movie actually reminded me of another Shudder original that just came out a few weeks ago called The Cellar with Alicia Cuthbert. That movie was an incredibly formulaic and boring haunted house movie with nothing interesting about it whatsoever, and these two are good examples of what Shudder shouldn't be acquiring. Shudder has supported some great independent horror films in the past, and these are really deeply uninspired examples of the genre. These shouldn't be the faces of that platform, because The Twin especially feels like a lesser copy of far better films that you could actually probably watch on Shudder. If you like this review, then you can buy me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's brand new Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can support my work on my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Burke, fading out.